Yes, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Her Excellency Ambassador Pak. I want to welcome to the launch of the Center for German Transnational Relations at King's College London. I'm Dr. Isabel Hartner, the director of the center. And we're very excited about this opportunity to introduce our center. We focus on studying Germany in the European and in the global context, its relationship with Europe and the world, and we do so in a interdisciplinary context. So we study German history, German politics, German culture, German economics in this transnational context. So today we are exploring the legacy of German and Korean unification policies, which of course is a very timely issue. As you will know, last Saturday, Germany celebrated the 30th anniversary of its reunification. So my colleagues, Dr. Katrin Schreiter and Dr. Ramon Pacheco-Pardo will be guiding you through the evening, introducing the guest speakers and so on and so forth. Now, I'm just going to say a few words about how we are proceeding here. You will first hear a video message by the director of the German Academic Exchange Services London office, Ruth Kral. They support our center. And this will then be followed by short videos in which our guest speakers make their introductory statements. We then have a live panel debate between our three speakers, and then at 7 o'clock, you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So please add your questions to the chat, and we will then let the speakers know. Now, for us, this is also a first. We have organized at King's, of course, lots of events and roundtables, but never online and in this forum. So please bear with us. If there are problems, we apologize, but we are really doing our best, and we are hoping that very soon we can meet you live and in person when it's safe again, and welcome you to King's College. And now I'm going to stop, and I wish you a pleasant event. Thank you very much.
A warm welcome from the German Academic Exchange Service London. With great pleasure, I have accepted Dr. Hartner's request to greet you with a few words at the start of the conference, Two Countries Divided, Unpacking the Legacy of German and Korean Unification Policies. Thank you, Dr. Hartner, and let me assure you and your esteemed guests that I will not take too much of your time, as there are clearly more interesting speeches and debates on the agenda than my remarks to you. Your Excellency, dear Professor Spohr and Professor Kwon, dear Dr. Streiter and Dr. Pacheco, dear distinguished guests and panelists. This year has truly been unprecedented. The pandemic is a fundamental turning point for all of us. Surely everyone will divide this year into a before and after a virus called COVID-19 hit the world. It is still too early to predict in total the outcome, but it is fair to say that the world will not be as it was before. Nevertheless, we have all adapted to the new normal and we are moving ahead. This conference, in its new format, is a very good example of our efforts to find new ways of communication and discourse, a thing which is in these challenging times more important than ever. For the DID, as the world's largest academic mobility organization, it is an obligation to hold on to the idea that collaboration is the core to find solutions for so many global problems. 30 years after reunification, Germans are still speaking about a before and after of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And at the time of the 30th anniversary, we are still in a permanent process of discussion, still disputing on how to move forward. Maybe we do have the inclination to focus too much on the past, but even if we do, again, also in this context, the most important thing is to keep exchanging views, acknowledging that there's still room for improvement. The DRD's motto, Wandel durch Austausch, change by exchange, can only be successful if there is exchange. And change should be a constant discourse to challenge the present and innovate another future. And in closing my remarks, I wish you all a fruitful exchange of ideas, an enjoyable, memorable, and productive time. And I'm looking forward to meeting you again some other day in person. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. We have introduction videos by our three panelists today. And the first video that we have is by Her Excellency Ambassador Park Na, who is the ambassador of the Republic of Korea to the UK. She has a background in history. She studied history at Johnson University and then received a master's degree in international relations at Columbia University at the School of International Affairs, where she was also a visiting fellow. She has served in New Delhi, Beijing, two times, New York, also twice, including the Korean mission to United Nations, and she was Deputy Minister of Public Diplomacy before coming here to London. So I'm going to leave you with her video address.
Hello, this is Anna Park, the Ambassador of the Republic of Korea to the UK. Before I begin, I'd like to sincerely congratulate the establishment of German Transnational Relations Center in King's College. The establishment is particularly noteworthy since we are commemorating the 30th anniversary of German reunification. I would like to express my appreciation to the organizers and to the distinguished guests who are attending this event online. First of all, I congratulate the 30th anniversary of German reunification. The reunification of Germany is the first case where two different systems of capitalism and socialism reunited without a war, and the ensuing integration process has been also highly successful. The division of Germany and the division of Korea have a similar aspect in that they originated at the end of World War II as a result of the World War rivalry between the Eastern and Western blocs. However, the background and outcome of these divisions are quite different. Following the division of the Korean Peninsula in 1945, a devastating war broke out in 1950, where antagonism and confrontation among the same peoples were intensified. Bitter Cold War rivalry continued long after the war was halted through the Armistice Agreement on 1953. Despite of our continuing efforts to establish peace and reconciliation through exchanges and cooperation in various ways, there are still many difficulties to this day in pursuing peace on the Korean Peninsula. As the Korean people witnessed the successful reunification of Germany, they have hope that two Koreas could also be reunited one day. So we have been making efforts to revitalize exchange and cooperation between the two Koreas and to resolve the North Korean nuclear issue, but the situation is still quite challenging. The Korean government is also looking at the integration process of Germany and has been conducting research both by the government and private sector while watching the integration process from various fields to help prepare for unification. On the Korean Peninsula, we are still living a despite of any challenges. We have also emphasized that a multilateral security system must be established. In particular, as this year marks the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of Korean War, we express our position that the war on the Korean Peninsula should be completely and permanently ended. Our government stands firm on this. The South and North must work together for peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula by complying with all agreements between the two Koreas and by restoring inter-Korean relations, which had hit a hurdle currently. We need to put in motion a virtuous cycle of inter-Korean relations and US-North Korea relations. In addition, it is necessary to resolve North Korean nuclear issue. Only when these issues are dealt with properly will the conditions for permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula be ripe. Even if peace dawns on the Korean Peninsula, there is still much work to be done until reunification, such as humanitarian concerns and the need to improve the quality of life of North Korea. We honestly need support and active engagement from the international community. The Korean government is benchmarking and researching the example of German reunification to prepare for reunification of Korea, which will come eventually. I feel that the UK can also play an important role in bringing about peace on the Korean Peninsula, as it is a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations and a leader in advocating a rule-based international order and peace. Based on our close partnership between South Korea and the UK, I hope our two countries will continue to work together to realize permanent peace on the Korean Peninsula. In closing, I look forward to an opportunity today to share various views on the 30th anniversary of German reunification and its ramifications on the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you. Next, we are going to move to a video by our second panelist, Professor Christina Spohr, who is Professor of International History at the LSE, and who is well known as a specialist in the international history of Germany since 1945. Her research specializes in questions about of world order, diplomacy and strategy, and the practice of applied history. She's the author of a dozen books, unedited volumes, and in her book, Post-World, Post-Square, Rebuilding the World After 1989, was published by William Collins and then by Yale University Press as well, will be coming out soon. There is also a German edition of this book that received a prestigious German award for the best political science book published in Germany. And here we have a video of her. She's going to give us a deep dive, a historical overview on Germany.
Good evening. I'm going to talk to you today about German unity and Korean division. On the 3rd of October 2020, Germany celebrated the 30th anniversary of the country's reunification. Like many major historical events, this was believed impossible until it was actually achieved. Korea to this day remains divided and a potential nuclear battleground. But what are the dynamics behind the process of dividing and uniting? After Hitler's defeat in 1945, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones. These had consolidated into 2 states by 1949 because the Soviet Union and the Western victor powers America, Britain, and France could not agree on how to prevent a united Germany being a threat to peace once again. This division between West and East Germany became a fixity of the international orders, marking the boundary between 2 global systems and by 1955, 2 military blocs, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The historic capital, Berlin, though in East Germany, was also divided into 4 sectors. Thus, Berlin was several times a flashpoint of Cold War confrontation, especially in 1948-9 and 1958-61. The tension was reduced thereafter, but only because the city was divided from 1961 when the USSR and the GDR built the Berlin Wall. Containing the German question was absolutely central to the thinking of the nuclear superpowers. Indeed, Germany was the main cockpit of the Cold War, and it was vital for Washington and Moscow to keep their confrontation cold. Korea, by contrast, seemed of secondary importance, effectively on the periphery. As a result, the situation got out of control, and in many ways remains so to the present day. After the Japanese surrender in 1945, the Korean peninsula was also divided into what became Soviet-occupied North and the American-occupied capitalist South. The 2 Koreas rapidly went their separate ideological ways, like the 2 German states. But in contrast to the cooling of tensions in the heart of Europe, apparent American indifference to Korea encouraged Stalin and Mao in 1950 to support a North Korean bid to unify the country by force. America's decision to fight for the South resulted in hot war on a horrendous scale. This war ended in 1953, but not with a peace treaty, but an armistice that is still unresolved. The division was cemented with a boundary along the 38th parallel and a demilitarized zone emerged. As the main victims of the conflict, the Korean people felt great bitterness, not just towards outside forces, but crucially against each other. This was an open national wound that also festers to the present day. So politically, unlike the 2 Koreas where the North completely sealed itself off, the 2 Germanys always remained in contact. They concluded a system of agreements and treaties to regularize relations at the official level and to secure a modicum of civil contacts and communications among ordinary people across the Iron Curtain. This created a certain, if frozen, stability. Now, in the German context, it was West Germany that thrived on the global plane, benefiting from the Marshall Plan and the subsequent 2 decades of economic miracle, turning the Bonn Republic, although only semi-sovereign, into one of the top world economic powers by the 1970s. And I will now not dwell on some of the detail, but you all know about Adenauer's Westbindungspolitik, achieving reconciliation with the Western neighbors, so much so that George H.W. Bush in 1989 dubbed West Germany America's partner in leadership. West Germany also followed this principle of historical continuity, the Reichsnachfolgestaat, whereas the GDR pursued an Abgrenzungspolitik, separating itself from the fascist and imperial German past and also from the Federal Republic. In fact, in West Germany, we had this whole business about mastering the Nazi past as the Western victor powers imposed. And there was still talk about unification in both German states and contacts across the border. Then we get the phase under superpower detente of Ostpolitik and Osthandel, the Helsinki Final Act, but crucially, by the early 1980s, there were no longer any unification plans in the drawers in Bonn. Nevertheless, because the divided country found itself in such a central position in geopolitics, we can see in retrospect how changing global conditions allowed a window of opportunity for unity to open in ways that were not replicated in the Far East. We have the ascendance of Mikhail Gorbachev in '85, who unleashes reforms inside the Soviet Union, which allows for the diffusing of superpower tensions in terms of nuclear arms reduction talks. And we see him taking away the fear of the tank from the Eastern Europeans. We see the revolutionary developments in Poland, Hungary, and so forth in 1989, and at the same time, the GDR celebrating 40 years of existence. But the Aussies voted with their feet. They began pouring out of East Germany as the Iron Curtain was lifted. And what happened in November 1989 was truly astonishing. Now, how was the fall of the wall possible? Mass demonstrations across the GDR had raised questions about the country's governability. Second, the regime was in a state of confusion not to use military force against its people, unlike in China and unlike what one might expect in North Korea. And furthermore, there was a series of comical political botch-ups on the 9th of November, which led to the very opening of the Berlin Wall. So with the breaching of the GDR's territorial integrity, German unity was suddenly back on the international agenda. And you know about the 10-point plan by Helmut Kohl on the 28th of November, which puts West Germany into the driving seat. We know that Margaret Thatcher, as she put it, feared a Fourth Reich, while the French worried that the European project would be derailed. In effect, Kohl opted for what was effectively a consensual takeover. And the March 1990 elections confirmed the East Germans' desire to get the Deutschmark and join the Federal Republic, a process that got completed in October 1990, now 30 years ago. Equally important, unification had the full support of the Americans, overriding French and British doubts and the consent of the now embattled Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, who was bought effectively with massive West German financial aid. Now, like all major decisions, this hastily forged solutions had negative and positive consequences, and that's what is interesting for us today.
Thank you. And now we move to the last video before we move into the debate, which is by Professor Hyun Kwon, who is a senior research fellow and professor of social anthropology at Trinity College in the University of Cambridge. He is the author of prize-winning books on the Vietnam War, social history, and also the Cold War conceptual history. And his new book that came out earlier this year with Cambridge University Press is After the Korean War, An Intimate History.
And especially in Berlin, the city of Berlin has had enormous ramifications in Korean Peninsula. As such, both South and North, albeit, as you can imagine, in quite different ways. To the North, it was an utterly shocking event. And the legacy of the shock, I think, still continues and reverberates in today's North Korean politics as such, both foreign and domestic politics. For the South, I think it generated enormous aspiration and hope for the immediate future, and which in due time was led to disappointment with situations in East Asia in comparison to Western Europe, meaning that what happened in Europe, people expected would be replicated in the context of Asia, but which, as we all know, was not the case. So eventually, it led to the notion that Korean Peninsula is an island of the Cold War. That is, whereas the Western Europe and the whole world had moved onto the so-called post-Cold War world, the peninsula remained stuck in the past, already in the era of the Cold War. So that created considerable anxiety as well as confusions as to the space and time of the Cold War era and post-Cold War world. We can't forget the vital difference between the German and Korea questions in the context of Cold War history, namely the fact that Cold War in Korea was not necessarily a Cold War, and it started with highly destructive, totalizing war experience in 1950 and 1953, which involved the United States, China, Soviet Union, and to a considerable extent, Japan, and as well as both Korea, right? So the Korea's Cold War experience started with a real war, whereas we can't say that in relation to Germany. So that means that, broadly speaking, Europe's experience of Cold War can be captured with the notion of Cold War meaningfully, or the equivalent terms such as imaginary war or the long peace, as many commentators know. Whereas that dominant narrative of Cold War era, we can't apply the notion too uncritically to the Korea question. So, in relation to the critical difference in historical experience between the two places, I think the process of national reconciliation, let's not talk about unification, reconciliation between the divided polities had rather different ramifications between the two places. Thank you.
So after we have finished with the three videos, I think there were a couple of reactions from the panelists already as to what has been said. Professor Spohr, I think you wanted to go first and comment on the videos?
Yes, hello. Yes, I found it very interesting to hear these Korean perspectives, and it also made me really think about, and perhaps something to highlight. When we talk about it today, 30 years later, it sort of sounds as if it was almost a historical one-way street. You know, unification eventually comes about. But perhaps what I would like to also highlight in the German case is, you know, I said in my video, well, you know, there were no blueprints in the drawer. And there is this element of surprise and this element of improvisation that, you know, when a window of opportunity opens, and that's where the leadership, the managers, as I call them, the managers of change come in, you know, they had to improvise. They tried to preserve or conserve certain elements, for instance, institutionally, the EC turned into the EU, the NATO survived. This became all part of the solution in the German story. But we must not forget the change agents in East Germany, especially the people that left by the thousands East Germany. This was like a bleeding wound. The country was, you know, collapsing. Then when they had their first free elections, they effectively voted for what was the continuity of the West German state form. So that leads to an absorption. But when we look at it 30 years later and you look at the language today, it is very interesting that especially in the eastern parts of Germany, they talk almost about it as a hostile takeover. They lost out, they lost their identity, they woke up one day in a completely different state. There's a sense of disorientation, there's a bitterness about somehow having lost their history. This looks sort of in terms of state politics like such a smooth process, which was in part due to the ingenuity of the leaders at the time and the spirit of cooperation between the Russians and the Americans, the Germans, the French and the British. But in terms of what it cost for the people, there is a human cost for all the successes. At the time, people were enthusiastic. They really wanted everything that was in the West. You see the same in Eastern Europe. The Hungarians, the Poles, they were all couldn't get fast enough into the European community or EU, into the European Union, the even more integrated Europe. But now there is a sense of loss of identity. They feel Brussels has taken something away from their sovereignty. There is almost like a national turn. They feel that this post-national Brussels is a bad thing. Just like East Germans, or many East Germans, feel somehow this unified German state is a continuity of West Germany, which of course it is, but it somehow doesn't represent them. Somehow they still feel like second-class citizens. So what I want to say, we heard about, in the Korean sense, there's this hope for reconciliation. I also think there aren't any plans for how do you now step-by-step unify. And could it be the German model? Does North Korea want to join South Korea? I doubt it. There has to something happen that state comes apart. And remember, North Korea is a nuclear power. It can seal itself off in that way, in a way that East Germany was not in global terms a player in that kind of way of being on that platform. But I'm sure South Koreans also think to do what the Germans did. It cost the Germans over 30 years, $2 trillion. If we think about it in terms of simply cost, if South and North Korea were to unify along the German model now, it would probably be more than $10 trillion. The difference is also living standards and alienation of society. And we heard about the significance of war between the two countries. There are distinct differences. And just finally, let's just not forget, there was a window of opportunity in 1989 as part of a sort of global transformation as we moved out of the Cold War into the post-Cold War era. And that was the European exit. But somehow the Korean question, the Korean division, was tied to the Chinese exit from the Cold War, which was different. China chose to go against the protesters with force. It opened economically, but not politically. North Korea actually oriented to China as the Soviet Union collapsed. So we have a different geopolitical circumstance that we have to bear in mind. There were conversations between South and North, but the nuclear issue that emerged in 1990-1991 is crucial to understand what is going on. I have gone on too long. Thank you.
That's very interesting. Thank you so much. Ambassador Park, would you like to react to the videos or to what Professor Spohr just explained about the Korean situation? You need to unmute yourself, please.
So you can hear me. Thank you very much for nice presentations by two professors, and you made very good points. Korean and the German cases, they have similarities, but also quite significant differences. Post-division era, and two Germans had continued exchanges in various forms, laying ground for integration, while the post-division era of Korea has been characterized by continued confrontation, hostility, conflicts, including the cruel inter-Korean War. So the level of antagonism and the perception on the other part as enemy has been intensified in Korea, which was not the case of Germany. And sufferings from people such as no contact among separated family members has continued in the Korean peninsula, while in Germany, families, they could visit each other. And the cost of division of Korea has been much, much costly. And Korea became a de facto island, cutting off any land connection to neighboring countries and Eurasia. So the biggest difference for sure is Germany achieved the reunification through the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, while Korea has not yet achieved. Why not? Because, I mean, as Professor just mentioned, we have different geopolitics. And the regional particularities in Asia and Europe, well, it influences the shape and the course of unification policy or integration policy in Germany and Korea respectively. Well, for example, Germany, it has been benefited by Helsinki process, which brought detente between two blocs. Accordingly, to Korea, Germany could manage and promote mutual exchange and reconciliation as ground building for unification. On the contrast, in East Asia, there has been no multilateral arrangements like a Helsinki process. And the collapse of the Soviet Union did not bring the end of Cold War regime in Korea, in our region. The Cold War legacy still remains strongly. The four major powers surrounding the Korean Peninsula have different interests in unification on Korean Peninsula. So it makes our process more complicated. So more complicated geopolitics play quite a strong role in our region. So German unification gives us hope that Korea will be united one day, but there are more challenges and complications ahead of us.
Thank you, Anna. That actually takes us to one of the questions I wanted to ask, right? It was about the regional environment. So, Professor Spohr, do you want to react to this? What impact do you think the European regional environment had on German reunification? And as we saw in the case of Asia, Ambassador Pak has already mentioned that maybe the regional environment has not been productive towards the two Koreas coming together.
Yeah, I think the European environment at large was very important because we heard just about the Helsinki Final Act, the Helsinki process. This did not become it didn't turn into an organization that became a completely new European security architecture. The Russians would have quite liked to have done so. The French had sort of a similar idea with a so-called European Confederation model. But multilateralism, nevertheless, is really important. And as I mentioned, the spirit of cooperation. What do I mean? I mean that, and this is of course tied to Germany's peculiar history, the Nazi past, that, you know, the neighbors of Germany, of both Germanys, were very concerned about unification. On the extreme end, you have Margaret Thatcher worrying about the Fourth Reich. She had always this map in her handbag and she picked it out and she said Germany is going to take back this and that, whatever territory in the Far East. Mitterrand was worried about that Germany would not remain bound in the European community, actually to the EU. And of course, the Poles, the Dutch, all the small neighbors were also really concerned. And why do I mention that? Also because on the day the wall fell, Helmut Kohl wasn't even in Germany. He was in Warsaw for a reconciliation meeting. So you can see how important, by being surrounded by neighbors, turning them into partners was for Germany. So what helped the peaceful solution, and what allowed also, at that point, the Soviet Union still existed, the Soviet Union to buy into this and to withdraw its Red Army troops from East Germany and Eastern Europe, was a Germany anchored in organizations that create stability. And because it was a spirit of cooperation, it was acceptable that, you know, because one knows known, one has these known knowns, to use the Rumsfeld term, that's what politicians like. They turned Europe into a solution for Germany, a unified Germany tied into an ever tighter, ever more integrated EU that will eventually also embrace the Eastern European countries once they can fulfill the criteria as they were knocking on the door. So remember, in 1995, it was Finland, Sweden, and Austria. They joined first. Only then came an Eastern enlargement because, of course, market economy and democracy had to be consolidated. This was also a time when the Soviet Union then collapsed in 1991, that West Germany and America, but especially West Germany, pumped a lot of money into Russia, Yeltsin's Russia, to support democratization and the move to a market economy. But law and order didn't take hold. There was chaos in terms of the economy. I don't need to go into this. This partnership with Russia from 1993 begins to turn because Russia also looks to China. It thinks about itself as a great power. It causes, in that sense, anxiety among the small eastern neighbors of Germany, who all the more want to join the West. The possibility of forging a solution had to do with the fact that the Germany that had to go to war in people's minds twice in the 20th century was now anchored in institutions. And America, by remaining a European power through the NATO, was the stabilizing anchor that even at that point under Gorbachev and the early Yeltsin years kept the Russians happy.
Wonderful. I think we have discussed quite a bit about the regional specificities of the two cases. So maybe now we can move a little bit more at the domestic level. Professor Spohr already mentioned that the costs of unifications were great. However, there were, the East Germans who went to the polls and voted for reunification, so to say, in March of 1990. So there was some kind of domestic feeling, some kind of domestic drive towards seeking reunification there. And I was wondering if both panelists could speak to how they see the situation, the domestic situation, similarly and differently between Germany back then and Korea maybe today or over the past few decades. Ambassador Park, if you want to take this question first.
Yes. Domestic situations, that's another quite complicated situation. Korea has been one country and one people through at least 2,000 years. But the passion for unification, I must admit that it is decreasing as time passes, especially among the younger generation. So Korean government is making efforts to raise awareness of unification issue among the young generation. So the urgent thing to do is to resolve so-called the sense of difference between the South and North Koreans. As I said, we have been one people sharing same culture, same history, same identity as Koreans throughout more than 2,000 years. However, 70 years of division without any meaningful exchange, but hostility had changed this sense of unity. Especially young generation who do not have any memory of the unity may feel the other part of Korea as stranger, not as our brothers and sisters. So it is quite urgent to advance quite a substantive exchange and cooperation between the two Koreas. If it is too late, maybe it will be very difficult to regain the sense of unity as one people. How to advance exchange? Well, under this circumstance, it is very there is some limit because of unwillingness of North Korean government and the sanction regime. However, small steps, possible steps at this stage, as also should be taken. And I recall that former Chancellor of West Germany, Bill Brandt, once said that small steps are better than no steps at all. So we already expressed our willingness to resume humanitarian assistance and exchange, restart the dialogue between two Koreas, and continue implementing the agreement made by two Koreas step by step. So under the sanction framework, even under sanction framework, we can take small projects. For example, issues such as health and medicine, disease control, climate change, which affects not only North Korean people, but also our South Korean people too. So we have to foster meaningful cooperation that will further open the path toward peaceful coexistence. So we will do our best to engage North Korea and to rebuild the sense of unity, not only for, North Koreans, but also for our own people. We have to build this sense of unity. Yes.
Professor Spohr, did you want to speak to the German situation that brought people to go onto the streets in November 1989 and also then go to the voting polls in 1990?
Yeah, I think actually the ambassador made some very important points there. This, you know, I talked about that, of course, there was this initial division, but in the German case, of course, it's a story of 40 years. So we're looking at 2 generations, and we're looking at the last 20 years under a policy that is colored also by this, you know, policy of small steps. There was always exchange, even remember in Berlin, even until the Berlin Wall was built in 1961, people could still move and go across. There was always a sense, then especially after Ostpolitik, that there is, even if there's 2 states, there is 1 nation. But of course, under the Helsinki Final Act, also, you know, this idea that there should be more travel, there should be more exchange, this human rights agenda. And there, of course, is also the peculiarity that East Germans, apart from in the so-called Tal der Ahnungslosen in certain areas of East Germany, could watch West German TV. They always were in their minds, they could see the two Germanys. That was, of course, a mirror image that then, and that is where, you know, empire by imposition comes in, when you compare the Eastern and the Western Bloc. The Eastern Bloc was that empire imposition, and what turns out, when, you know, you look at the structural factors, that the planned economy isn't working, and some say, yeah, that would have brought the collapse about anyway. I would argue absolutely crucial is also the fear of the tank, because you see the Chinese solution and you see the survival of North Korea, which is also a regime that rules through fear. When Gorbachev abolished the Brezhnev doctrine, and people started to believe that that is true, and actually also in the East German context, we saw a little bit of, you know, dissidentism, of course, all along, especially from the late 70s, 80s onwards. But then people were really annoyed in the elections in May 1989 that, you know, the SED had this big gain and everybody felt they hadn't even voted, or they certainly hadn't voted SED, I mean, by basically not voting. So people started to demonstrate, and the Honecker regime was so paralyzed that actually they didn't do anything. Then they had this anachronistic celebration of 40 years of GDR in October 1989, shortly after 40 years of celebrating the People's Republic of China. Everybody in East Germany worried, will there be a Chinese solution applied to these big Monday demonstrations, especially on the Monday after the 40th anniversary? But it wasn't, for 2 reasons. The Soviets really did abolish the Brezhnev doctrine. Gorbachev did not call up the Soviets in the barracks on East Germany to hold on to the communist regime in East Germany, and the East Germans didn't shoot their own people. For various reasons, paralysis in the regime, orders not given, but also a sort of sense that this would perhaps be not the right thing. What you see is then, you know, an ever-growing strength of people in the street, and that brings out different strands, what people want. They first of all say, we are the people, we want freedom of travel, we want freedom of speech, we want free elections, we want reforms. At the same time, because of the opening of the border between Hungary and Austria and the possibility in East Germany to escape that way, you have a pouring out of people. So you have those who stay at home and want change, and those who keep pouring out by the thousands. I don't want to now tell the story of the fall of the wall and, you know, how that had to do with the travel law and a botched press conference and so forth. But what matters is that after the wall is open, these people still keep pouring out, and reform can't come fast enough, and the state is collapsing politically and economically. And when it becomes clear that there will be free elections in East Germany, which are then advanced to March 1990, that West Germany will no longer prop up the East German state with West German money and the people still keep pouring out, then Helmut Kohl's ideas that we do this unification via Article 23, in other words, the East Germans simply join West Germany as a state, but we have to see how the elections go. People vote for the Deutschmark, for the German monetary union, which the Germans can do themselves, and this being absorbed into the West German state structure, because that's the fastest way. And everything else is organized with the four victor powers, 2+4. There is no peace treaty in that sort of traditional post-war sense. So in a nutshell, it matters that the people say, we are the people, and then we are one people. The pressure comes from the people, and then the people speak at the ballot box. But their image, what they were going for, was that West German chancellor. In contrast to all the other Eastern European states, the East Germans could always look west. They weren't in the end anymore interested in just reforming their own state. They didn't want a separate state. They wanted unity as fast as possible to get prosperity and stability. And there was no sort of thinking, oh yeah, 40 years of East Germany is exactly the kind of thing we want. This sort of middle way of reforming East Germany as a second independent democratic state, that died fairly rapidly. And that is important when we look at how history is now being rewritten, when many East Germans now say, yeah, but it was a hostile takeover by the West Germans in their imperialist drive to impose what they wanted. People must not forget how important that electoral revolution was, the going to the ballot box and what they voted. They voted for what Allianz für Deutschland, effectively the CDU's sister party.
Thank you. And before we move to the Q&A with our audience, we have, I guess, the million-dollar question for Ambassador Pak. We have elections coming up in the US. Obviously, we don't know who's going to win. We are trying to look into our crystal ball. But how do you think the outcome of the election might affect relations between South Korea and North Korea?
Well, it's quite a difficult question to answer. Whoever wins, we strongly believe that ROK and the US should strengthen our endeavors to establish a permanent peace and to resolve North Korean nuclear issue with a sense of priority and urgency. Now, as history shows, waiting for change and merely hoping that time is on our side, merely hoping that the situation resolves itself will never lead to a better future. Probably it will worsen the situation. So in my opinion, returning to the previous administration's so-called strategic patience policy cannot be a viable option. So whoever wins, more vigorous negotiations with North Korea are expected. And the Korean government will continue to closely work through the ROK-US alliance to resolve the denuclearization issue and to place permanent peace on the peninsula. And our attitude, United States and Korea, should be that of an ice-breaking ship that navigates new waters by breaking through thick ice, because we are not going to sail through calm and open seas, but troubled and uncharted water, which is North Korea with nuclear weapons. So we believe the ROK and UK will continue to work together as pathfinder for our joint mission to bring peace and denuclearization on the peninsula. This is our strong hope. And I also hope your full support to our endeavor.
Thank you, because not everyone will have tackled that question. We can move now to questions from the audience. I think we already have a couple coming up. Catherine, do you want to pick up the first question, maybe?
Yes, we have a question from Jeff, who asks whether the panelists would agree that when thinking about any potential Korean unification, the most important actors are perhaps the most enigmatic from outside. So the North Korean citizenry. And given the central role played by the GDR citizenry, once the context made it possible, as Professor Spohr also explained, is there any way to understand what sorts of information gets past North Korean restrictions and what sorts of hopes and desires the North Koreans have? Maybe this is a good one for Ambassador Pak.
So the question is the sources we may get information from. about what the North Koreans really think. So I mean, is it the question?
It was more the other way around. If you know what kind of information the North Korean citizens have, if they if there's any way of information from South Korea to get into North Korea, so that a similar process like in East Germany, where East Germans could watch TV, Western well, some newspapers, if something like this, or is it all shut down?
I don't think, I mean, as ordinary people, they have an access to any information, what's going on in South Korea, what's going on in the world. And so, sorry, because they are blocked from, just give me some minute. Ramon, can you intervene a little bit?
I'll come back. Yes.
I'm happy to, I think the ambassador is pointing to the right thing there, in the sense that, what information people outside elite circles really get from the West. I think she pointed to this alienation also within society, even towards relations with fellow family members in the South. So that even, since there isn't any communication on a personal level, there isn't much sort of transmitted. And I imagine that is quite significant then if you tie it to being scared of repercussions, that the will to rise up, you have to have quite a lot of, even in the East German case, you had to have quite a lot of certainty, even to run away from East Germany, but also to protest. And that sort of swelling, I don't think that people in North Korea have the opportunity in that sense, are ready to, even form, let's say, informal groups where they could begin to galvanize some activity. Like, even we saw in the Polish case with the solidarity movement. But I'm not an expert and I can't look into the North Korean glass ball. Oh.
Ambassador Park, please unmute yourself.
Okay, on the one hand, the North Koreans have no access to informations except some elite group or party, high-level party members. And on the other side, the outside world also has a limitation in getting information about North Korea. And, there is no free exchange of visits, and South Koreans and even, other nationalities, they can't freely enter North Korea. And even, they're traveling into North Korea, their contact with North Korean people are quite, controlled. So you don't have much opportunity to have free exchange of views with North Koreans. So it's very difficult to know what North Koreans, so what category of North Koreans have what kind of ideas and opinion, or but it seems the North Korean regime has a very tight control and a tight grip on information and on the people too. So there is a very limited source of information about North Koreans, and I don't think, it is not realistic to expect any kind of any kind of movement from the people. And if there is any change, most probably the change will come from the top. Yes.
And talking about change, we do have a question about change in policy by the US, but also by South Korea, and it comes from the chat, and it's asking whether it is plausible to solve the North Korean nuclear issue, or whether we should accept that North Korea is a nuclear state, it is unlikely to denuclearize, and we have to deal with North Korea as it is, rather as like we would like it to be. What do you think? Should we move towards acceptance of North Korea as a nuclear state?
Not at all. It's not acceptable for us to accept North Korea as a nuclear state. But we also acknowledge that North Korea, they will not denuclearize all of a sudden. And in order to induce North Korea to take a path of denuclearization, we should be very patient, and trust building and peace building should go together. So step-by-step approach here, on one hand, giving them more favorable environment for them to change themselves. Then slowly, we can induce them to the path of denuclearization. So that's why we believe in integration is one of the key to move North Korea toward the goal of denuclearization. So without integration, without trust building, and without the sense of security from the perspective of North Korea, we know that they will not give up nuclear weapons, because they believe that it is the last resort for their safety, their security, and their survival. So we have to change the whole perception, but it should be based on mutual trust, and we believe that it can be done through trust building process.
Wonderful. We have a follow-on question on this, and that is, you mentioned earlier, both of you, the politics of smaller steps that Willy Brandt put in place with Ostpolitik in Germany, but that Ambassador Park also said would be an example to follow for reconciliation and maybe even reunification in Korea. So the question of peaceful coexistence and reconciliation in terms of the two Koreas, could one think a little bit further and maybe reignite some of the earlier attempts of the last 20 years of having an active, inter-Korean relationship, especially with a view to the US presidential election?
Well, we also take lessons from German case, and we know that German situation and the Korean situations and our environment and quite different. So we can't just follow exactly the path of the model of German unification. But we got some lessons from German reunification, that Korea was divided against our will, like Germany, but the German unification teaches us that peace and reconciliation can be achieved through our efforts. But before we are talking about unification, we have to manage the division in a proactive way, especially ensuring peaceful coexistence, eliminating threats of war. And as Professor mentioned earlier, the cost for unification of Germany was huge, and there were human sufferings. And if the German model applies to Korean unification, then probably the cost will be beyond our capacity. So we have to do some groundwork for eventual unification. We don't have to rush for unification. And the most important thing is peaceful coexistence, then gradual integration, reducing the existing gap. And at the time of the unification of Germany, the gap, economic gap between two Germanies, probably it was less than 10 times I do not have an exact figure, but in Korean case, national GDP and per capita income, it's several hundreds times difference. How we can manage if unification is just given all of a sudden out of blue? So it's better to unification. To me, in my view, it is better to come when we are prepared by achieving substantial integration. So unification should be a result of integration, not like Germany. Germany, you have the unification and you integration, social and economic integration came later. But in our case, it should be the opposite. Economic and the social integration should come first. Then, as a result, unification may come. So the unification is not our immediate goal. Our immediate goal is peaceful coexistence and mutual prosperity. Then the outcome, natural outcome, will be unification. That is the approach we are taking.
Okay, thank you very much. Actually, that ties in very nicely to what Professor Spohr was talking about the costs of reunification. Professor Spohr, do you see actually the Koreans here taking the right lessons from the German experience? Could you tell us a little bit more about what came after October 3rd, 1990, when it comes to economics?
Yeah, I could also frame it in this question of, the preparation, because in some ways, of course, this combination of Ost and West politic by the 80s was, on the one hand, unification seemed so far away, but on the other hand, in those who still thought about it always hoped it would be some kind of managed process. I'm in part wondering whether it was in the end only manageable because everything went higgledy-piggledy, suddenly, big change, and it had to be managed fast, and with ingenuity and spirit of cooperation, it was fast possible, and that window of opportunity was grasped. Because remember, the other side, the Social Democrats suggested that the two Germanys should join as equals and create a new constitution and create a new state, and everything should be step by step, and then one could weigh out the costs. But it may be that negotiation linked together with the four victor powers or some other kind of much wider peace treaty that was on the cards, that could have gone on for so long, and then the Soviet Union would have collapsed. Maybe it wouldn't have happened at all. Or people would have said, oh, it's so costly, why should we even bother? Because remember, when the East Germans kept pouring to West Germany, also from the Soviet Union were coming so-called Russlanddeutsche. Germany absorbed over 1 million people in a year. And the tide could have turned quite fast, and people would have said, well, why should we pay for all of that? There might be fellow citizens, but why are we paying for them? Now think about as we heard, a several hundred times bigger differential. Also alienation, we also have malnutrition, bad health in many North Koreans, simply because the food situation is so bad. I mean, the problems are staggering. In the German case, you could say they're economic, they're political, and up to a point emotional in terms of the identity and so forth. But it is still manageable in a wider process. Perhaps something unexpected needs to happen with the North Korean leadership, that there's even willingness to talk. And here I would like to link to another aspect, because the nuclear question really makes it different. And although South Korea obviously isn't a nuclear power, it is under and hopefully the Americans become more predictable, that the South Koreans feel that, there isn't a power vacuum left by America sort of withdrawing and leaving the Pacific open to all sorts of power shifts. And that can create instability and its own dangers, and create anxiety for the Japanese and what are the Chinese doing and so forth. If that American-South Korean relationship is steady, think about how did suddenly Reagan and Gorbachev be able to talk about nuclear arms reductions. We talked about how important for the peace is the denuclearization. You need to have some kind of spark that allows communication and trust, so that you can do trust and verify, and only when there's trust can you negotiate. Then we can think about, is then unification at some point in such a better context possible? But as long as there's stalemate, both in terms of worries over security, and you have the whole mountain of thinking about social and economic cost, and under what kind of model, Should it be then a Korea under the South Korean model, or should it be some kind of different Korea? And what, as we heard, what do we know what the North Koreans want? In the German case, surprisingly, we heard very quickly what the East Germans wanted. It made life so much easier. But here we have a sort of double problem, that we have a huge security problem on this peninsula, which is tied to big power politics. Russia, China, and America. It has to do with world order in the Pacific and stability in the Pacific. It's actually really crucial. So it has to do also with this American-South Korean relationship and predictability and stability. Diplomacy can only work when that toolbox is applied, if you want to create good politics.
Now, questions keep pouring on our chat. Thank you very much. And the next one refers to the role of the UK when it comes to supporting Korean reunification. And a member of the audience is asking, why should the UK be involved, interested in Korean reunification, and also what could the UK contribute to a potential process of reunification, or at the very least reconciliation?
Well, let me address that question. Why UK should support peace establishment on Korean Peninsula and in long-term unification of Korea? And because Korean issues is not just a Korean issue, as one of the global issues, and it is an agenda of international peace. Korea, as I said, its geopolitics is quite complicated, and the four major powers among surroundings South Korea, they have different interests, and if the peninsula becomes more volatile and unstable, then it will become a hotspot of instability of the world. So that's why UK has to support the peace building and the denuclearization and unification on the Korean Peninsula, because the UK is, as I said in my presentation, as a member of Security Council, not just member, is the permanent member of the Security Council, which is responsible of peacekeeping of the world. And UK has, after Brexit, your slogan is Global Britain. Global Britain means what? And you make contribution to international peace and international order. And you are responsible for building a better world for all together. So UK is indispensable partner for us toward our road of denuclearization and peace on the Korean Peninsula. And then you are not only the UK is not the only one of the permanent members. UK has think tanks, very prestigious think tanks like King's College, and you are the international opinion leader, and you have to contribute to the discourse of building peace in Korea and in the world. So that is the expectation we have for the UK's role.
Thank you. It's good to hear that we can actually contribute to support the processes taking place in the Korean Peninsula. Now, Professor Spohr, actually, building on this question, what about Germany? We have heard what the UK can contribute to the process of inter-Korean reconciliation, potential reunification. In specific terms, Germany, that actually has an embassy in Pyongyang, and North Korea obviously has an embassy in Berlin as well. It has the experience as well, and obviously Germany has very strong relations with South Korea. In practical terms, what do you think that Germany can contribute to inter-Korean reconciliation?
I think the ambassador just said it beautifully, that certain countries have to take international responsibility, and if they stand for in some ways a sort of global politics based on principles and values and norms to create stability and peace, then Germany certainly should be at the forefront of doing so. What you are seeing in some ways is, of course, perhaps Germany not quite as much on the front as you would expect of a power that is a strong economic power, that's perhaps the leading power in the European Union, and yet it shies away in moments of having to take political responsibility in global affairs. Germany likes to hide behind others, which comes, of course, out of its World War II legacy. So I think if we sort of think what we would hope what Germany would do, that it has a bit more confidence as a sovereign united state, that it also carries a little bit more of its political leadership onto the global stage in a consensual way with its partners, and puts forward in terms of leadership some constructive ideas precisely in these processes that the ambassador highlighted, and where Germany in some ways has, of course, good experience. Trust building policy of small steps, also using economic ties. I mean, when countries start to develop economic ties between each other, cultural ties, that helps to create networks at all levels. And somehow this process of communication needs to be reestablished. I mean, the trouble is that in the Korean situation, we have an element of there's one Korea and the other. There has to be some kind of de-alienation. One has to get into a position where one doesn't anymore just talk at each other, but one starts again talking with each other. And you need to help the two states to find a common language that actually communication is again in a constructive way possible. I would hope that Germany would take a much stronger role in this kind of politics. But maybe right now this is not possible in the COVID crisis and ahead of the election.
Well, thank you very much. Very interesting points. Ambassador Park, did you want to respond to Professor Spohr?
Well, I mean, of course, I fully agree with her. Major countries like Germany, who is the advocate of global goods, like global value, universal values, and international norms, you can help a lot in building peace on the Korean Peninsula. So we appreciate German contribution to our peninsula peace and the nuclear issues. And I appeal the agenda of bringing peace to the Korean Peninsula will remain as a priority of the global peace initiatives and the collective efforts of international community, and should be intensified. So countries like the UK and Germany should take some more proactive role in pursuing that goal. And I have a strong belief that Germany and the UK will continue to be supporters and advocates for it.
Thank you. Do you think that beyond individual countries, also the EU could play a role?
Yeah, I mean, these days, we are quite, as ambassador to the UK, we are quite, preoccupied with all the Brexit issues. But regardless, UK leaves EU, Europe as a whole, EU are advocate of international norms, and the EU certainly, as an important player, as a collective group. We definitely we are quite relying on your full support.
Wonderful, thank you. Looking at the time, I see that we've spent a wonderful hour discussing the German and Korean unification policies in all its global and local ramifications. I would like to thank our speakers for being, available, lending their expertise and their position to our event. It's been wonderful. Unfortunately, Professor Kwon was not able to join us tonight, but at least we heard from him in the video. So also a great thanks to him. And with that, I will hand over to the director of our center, Dr. Isabel Hartner, for some concluding remarks.
Yes. Whoops. Gonna take things off. Thank you very much, Katrin. Thank you very much, Ramon, for moderating the debate. But I would like to thank our guest speakers first and foremost for sharing their insights on this topic, and for showing how complex it is and how difficult comparisons can be. That even though there can be certain parallels, it is a different situation. The world is in a different place now. So comparisons work to a certain extent, but then we also have to recognize that there are big differences. So thank you very much for this insightful debate. We have our next event lined up. So here is the slide. That one will take place on the 22nd of October. It will be about party politics in Germany 30 years after reunification, the slow death of the political center. And we have 3 speakers lined up, Sarah Williarty, Kai Arzheimer, and Dan Huff, who will be speaking about German party politics. I'm going to be moderating that debate, and you can sign up on Eventbrite if you are interested. I will also send an email around. If you would like to join our mailing list, please let me know. My email address is there, and I will add you to the list, and you will learn more about the events that we are organizing. So thank you so much to the audience for being there, for bearing with us despite one or the other technical issue, and for asking those fantastic questions. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you soon again at the next events.
Katrin, can I just make a few words in conclusion? Thank you very much, Isabel, for organizing such wonderful event, and also Karin and Ramon for moderating in an excellent way, and the other panelists for your big contribution to this very important issue. And my final words are, we Koreans have every right to live peacefully, free from any fear of war and nuclear threat. This is our long aspiration, which should be accomplished the sooner the better. So we just can't wait and see, particularly taking into account the continuing undescribable enormous suffering of North Korean people. So let's build up stronger partnership toward this road. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.